Chapter 33. Christmas 1982. I lived in North Dallas, and everywhere I went, airports, restaurants, supermarkets, people recognized me. Between my weekly appearances on KTVT, WTBS, and World Class Championship Wrestling, I was seemingly on TV every day, and became so famous it was overbearing at times. However, I also noticed that many of the people who recognized me seemed to be casual fans of wrestling. They would watch it on TV every week, but weren't the type to go to an unair-conditioned building like the Sportatorium and see us live. I understood that we had a hardcore group of wrestling fans who would show up to see us no matter where the show was, when the show was, or what the weather was like, but I also understood that in order for Texas wrestling to get to the next level, we had to inspire our casual fans to want to see us live. With that in mind, I felt that if I promoted a big show properly, I could get our casual fans to see us in a building like Texas Stadium or the Reunion Arena a few times a year. This was not a decision I made lightly, because if I booked a super card in the Reunion Arena, which held 21,000 people, and only brought in 5,200 people, which is what we drew every week at the Sportatorium, I would be putting my job at stake. However, I was confident I could pull this off. I knew that in order to make these supercards really stand out in the fans' minds, and to be able to promote them differently than I normally would, they would need to have a catchy, memorable name. At the time, my sons were gigantic Star Wars fans, and had all of the figures and play sets. God, I must have spent hundreds of dollars on those toys. I was watching them play on the floor one day with toys like the Bespin Guards and the Hoth Ice Planet, and then it hit me, wrestling Star Wars. When I first presented the idea to Fritz, he liked the supercard concept, but felt that it may be copyright infringement to call it Star Wars. He had his attorneys check it out, and they assured us that as long as we called it Wrestling Star Wars we would be safe. We scheduled our first big show on October 25, 1981 at the Reunion Arena, and when the announcers started talking about it, it was clear that his was going to be something special. And sure enough, the fans who wouldn't see us regularly were inspired to go to Wrestling Star Wars just based on the hype. On the night of the show, we hung 3 disco balls in the building so there were blue and white lights with stars all over the place. We had smoke and strobe lights for the wrestlers' entrances, and we used the soundtrack to the Star Wars movie for the opening ceremony. Compared to what's done today, it wouldn't be all that much, but for those days it really was a fabulous production. The night was a huge success, and we brought in so many more fans than we normally did that I set up a schedule in 1982 so that I could build to 4 more big shows, one in March, June, August, and the final one on Christmas night, to be held in large arenas like Texas Stadium and the Reunion Arena. By building to 4 big shows a year, I knew I could make my top guys $20,000 just on those shows alone, and that was very important to me that my crew knew they were all figured in for some big paydays. Sure, they could get $250 in Fort Worth and $300 in Dallas every week, which was good, but nothing compared to what they could make on the big shows. During this time period, even though Fritz had been wrestling on a part-time basis for a few years, he announced to me one day, "Your 5 years are up." If you recall, when Fritz brought me in as booker in 1976, he told me that he wanted to be out of the ring in 5 years. It was now 6 years later and time for him to have his retirement match, so I started looking around for his final opponent. I saw a job guy from Florida named Big Daddy Bundy, and I knew I could make a monster out of him. I got in touch with him through my friend Kevin Sullivan, and when I told Bundy that I had a spot open for him in Texas to work with Fritz von Erich, he realized this was his big break and jumped at the offer. Once he arrived, I had him sit in the audience for all of our TV tapings, and anytime Fritz would come out for an interview, Bundy would heckle, "Hey old man, it's about time you retired." Fritz would just look at him, and carry on with his interview. We did this a couple of weeks in a row in both Dallas and Fort Worth, and one day while Fritz was doing an interview, I walked out with Bundy. Once Fritz realized that I was the one behind his heckler, the challenge was made, and we were ready. I changed his name to King Kong Bundy, put him in a singlet, and also came up with a gimmick where he had to cover people for the count of 5 rather than 3. I looked at that as a subtle thing to put him in a different category than the other monster heels. Then, I booked Bundy in a couple of matches that drew well but stunk. Bundy was never more than a 6-minute guy, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, I like him, but let's be honest, he was limited. Even though he was green, I booked him for our first Texas Stadium show against Fritz in his retirement match. After his match with Fritz, Bundy had a hair versus hair match with Kerry where he got his head shaved. Believe it or not, Bundy looked like Yukon Eric or Klondike Bill when he came to Texas. In addition to his head, I also had him shave his eyebrows, because I was envisioning him to be like Skull Murphy, and that gave Bundy the perfect look, because he was real light-skinned. I've heard everyone from Bill Watts to Fritz von Erich get credit for creating King Kong Bundy's gimmick, but I assure you it was me. Success has many fathers, but failure is always a bastard. In addition to my regular crew in Texas, I also brought in names from other territories such as the Junkyard Dog and Ernie Ladd from Mid-South, Andre the Giant from the WWF, and NWA champions Harley Race and Ric Flair to give wrestling Star Wars added prestige. It's sad to say, but my scheduling the big Texas shows is where Fritz and my relationship started going downhill. When I was hired as the booker in 1976, the average house in Dallas was $4,600. By 1982, I had gotten the average up to $14,800 per show. In 1976, Fort Worth was averaging $2,600 a show, and by 1982, I had brought it up to $9,200. Keep in mind that all of those averages don't include the big shows at the Reunion Arena and Texas Stadium. Based on the deal that Fritz and I made when I was hired, my average weekly commission on the Dallas shows was $1,020, and my average in Fort Worth was $660. After a while, Fritz resented paying me $1,680 every week in commission, and tried to downplay the success I had in raising the averages by claiming the real reason the houses were going up was because we were charging more, and not because I was getting more people in the building. Fritz must have been awfully poor as a child, because I've only known a few people with his type of greed in my life. He was intent to keep every penny he made for himself, and money was like his god. It was clear to me that Fritz was just being greedy, and looking for a way to get out of our original agreement. Fritz also knew that once we started running in the bigger arenas like Texas Stadium and the Reunion Arena, the houses were sure to jump drastically, and he felt that in big buildings like those, which cost more to run in, I shouldn't hold him to our original deal. My feeling was that I helped him bring Texas wrestling into the big time, got us in a position where we could get into big buildings, and tripled our attendance. As far as I was concerned, I deserved that commission. I called Jim Barnett and told him of the impasse Fritz and I were at. He felt it was a simple problem to solve, and suggested I take the house we drew for the first Star Wars in October 1981, which was $50,000, and at the $14,000 weekly average from the Sportatorium. Then, for any of the future big shows that gross over $64,000, I would make $100 for every $1,000. There's no way he can say no to that, Jim said. It's more than fair. Even though I could have asked for a lot more, I was really trying to make this work. I also knew that if I got $50,000 in for the first big show, I could do better the next time out. I presented the deal to Fritz, and he begrudgingly agreed to it. When the great Kabuki and I were traveling to Atlanta on our weekends to make appearances on TBS and at the Omni, Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy were wrestling for Georgia Championship Wrestling. They had been together since 1979, calling themselves the Fabulous Freebirds, but they broke up in 1981 and were feuding throughout the territory. I was sitting in the back of an arena before a show one day, when the two of them approached me and asked what I thought about the fact that they had just broken up. I told them that whoever advised them to break up did them a great disservice, because they were just perfecting the Fabulous Freebirds gimmick, and were getting so hot that the last thing they should have done was even consider breaking up their act when they did. They both nodded their heads and gave me a look like they agreed with me 100%. I then assured them, "Look, guys. If you decide to reform, give me a call. I would love to have the Fabulous Freebirds in Texas." And I meant that. I knew what a great act they had, and there was no doubt in my mind that they would get over phenomenally well in Texas. Also, keep in mind that the World Class Championship Wrestling show was not a year old yet, and I was well aware that the show was giving the world a new look at Texas wrestling. And as the producer and matchmaker of the show, I couldn't have a fresh start with talent who had been there a long time. I needed new blood, so I was very happy when Michael called me saying that he and Terry would like to reform the Fabulous Freebirds. Needless to say, I immediately brought them to Texas. I wanted to bring them in as heels and have them feud with the Von Erich boys, but Fritz felt that it would be better to bring them in as friends of the Von Erich boys. I went along with that, and shortly after the Fabulous Freebirds started appearing on our programs, entering the ring to the music of Leonard Skinner's Freebird, as good as business had been, it picked up. I instantly knew that the Fabulous Freebirds were going to be the next big thing in Texas. Then, without anyone paying attention, I booked Kevin and David Von Erich against the Fabulous Freebirds in Lawton, Oklahoma, just to see if there was any chemistry between them. I always felt that the Fabulous Freebirds against the Von Erichs would be a match made in heaven, but that one match told me everything I needed to know, and the electricity they created that night convinced me that I was going in the right direction. I'm very pleased to look back and realize I gave the Fabulous Freebirds a rebirth in Texas, because it would have been a shame for them to have remained broken up after 1981. And when I brought in the Fabulous Freebirds, I realized that not only would I get a great series of matches between them and the Von Erich boys, but I would also get a huge bonus match, Bruiser Brody versus Terry Gordy. Who wouldn't want to see that? I booked the two of them together quite a bit, and their matches were always excellent. The Fabulous Freebirds also really helped me solidify world-class championship wrestling as a TV show ahead of its time, and they deserve a lot of credit for the success of that show. I can also take credit for reuniting all three of the Fabulous Freebirds in 1982. One night, Buddy Roberts, a former member of the Fabulous Freebirds who left the group in 1981, came down to visit with Michael and Terry before a show. I had known Buddy since 1970, when I met him at Madison Square Garden, and had really gotten to know him when he was a member of the Hollywood Blondes during my 1974 run in Florida. I even brought him into Dallas in the late 70s as Dale Valentine, billing him as the brother of Johnny Valentine. As Michael, Terry, and Buddy were talking and reminiscing, I realized that since I had 3 Von Erichs, I should also have 3 Fabulous Freebirds, so I asked them if they would consider reuniting the original trio. Michael, Terry, and Buddy were excited about my idea, and Buddy agreed to re-dye his hair blonde and join up with the Fabulous Freebirds that very night. When I assumed the book in 1976, I inherited 5 titles, and over the years I created 7 more. I trusted my crew, and while I didn't require a deposit for the title or anything like that, I was always cautious on who I put belts on, and didn't just give them to anyone. Titles were, to me, just a way to add some drama to matches by putting the belts on the line, tools to get the fans into a match, and a great way to get a wrestler over, but a lot of the guys took the titles a little too seriously, and would rather make $150 and be a champion, than make $200 and put another champion over. There were many different techniques that I used to give a title match added luster. A lot of times I would book a non-title match in, say, Fort Worth with the NWA champion. Take Harley Race versus Kerry Von Erich, for example. The stipulation would be that if Kerry won, the return title match would be in Dallas, and if Harley won, their following title match would be in St. Louis, Missouri. By doing something so subtle like that, it made it seem as if their match was so over and so important that multiple cities wanted it and were actually bidding for it. I also used phantom title switches as a positive thing to say that our champion was so popular that he was traveling the country defending the title. For example, I might have our announcer say that the American title changed hands in someplace like Portland or Los Angeles, which not only made the champion look bigger than he was, but it also made the belt seem more important than it really was. See, I didn't look at it like a phantom switch, I looked at it as a way to give credibility to the champion, his popularity in other areas, and the importance of the title, because more than one state wanted it. When it came to titles in the Texas booking office, I had a grand scheme, a clear overview, a long-term vision of where I was going, and I did every title change and every phantom switch for a specific reason. In any event, the titles I inherited were the American title and the American Tag Team title, which is what the top guy and the top tag team in the area held, the Texas title and the Texas Tag Team title, which were important because all of the fans connected with Texas, which made them very powerful belts, and the Brass Knuckles title, which was defended in anything goes, no disqualification matches. They were the major titles in Texas, and were institutions that had been around for years. However, no matter how many titles Texas had, the one that was respected more so than anything else was the NWA World title. In 1979, I found myself in a bit of a jam. Our weekly show on KTVT was 90 minutes, and featured 7 matches. I realized that since we were giving all 7 matches away for free on TV, there was no incentive for our semi-casual fans to come to see the taping live. Since ratings meant nothing back then, the responsibility as booker was to bring live attendance up, so I immediately pulled 2 matches off TV, and in their place I started booking 2 out of 3 Falls matches for a TV title. That 2 out of 3 Falls match immediately covered 3 of my segments, and if any of the fans at home wanted to see the other 2 matches, they would have to come to the arena and buy a ticket. Therefore, I brought the TV title to Texas simply because I could no longer give away everything on TV. Other than that, what purpose does a TV title really have, anyways? As Terry Funk once asked, a TV title? What about the dishwasher title or the vacuum cleaner title? The NWA shared one world champion, but all the territories had their own version of the World Tag Team title. Florida, Detroit, and Georgia had, at one time or another, their own World Tag Team titles, but Texas never had one. Therefore, in 1981, I saw to it that we finally got a World Tag Team Championship title of our own. I also created a lot of other titles for Texas, such as the Caribbean title, which was good for Fort Worth, because the Latinos would line up to see it defended, the women's title, although that was just a one-off thing, and the All-Asian title and the All-Asian Tag Team title. Those particular belts were to satisfy the Japanese market, because world-class championship wrestling matches occasionally aired on TV Tokyo. Whenever I introduced new titles like that, I would have Bill Mercer explain that they were well-respected titles in Japan or the Caribbean, and introduce it in a way that was acceptable to the fans. Anyways, the reason I'm going into all of this detail about titles in Texas is because when the Fabulous Freebirds started, I brought yet another title to Texas, the six-man tag team title. Instituting that one was a no-brainer though, especially given my long-term plans for the Fabulous Freebirds and the Von Erichs. As I mentioned earlier, I had booked the Von Erichs and the Fabulous Freebirds in a match in Lawton, Oklahoma, just to test the waters. There was no angle, and they were both fan favorites, but based on their chemistry that night, I knew I had something big, and that I could get a year-and-a-half run out of them, easy. I wanted a long-term program, so I knew I would have to set the stage very carefully and really convince the fans that this was a truly personal battle. I also knew that in order for this to work, I had to do something outlandish that had never been done before. And while what's remembered today is the big angle itself, not many people recall the build-up, and I put just as much thought into the build-up as I did to the actual angle. Building to a big angle is like baking bread. You have to let the build rise and have to watch it, and know exactly when it's ready. Since Kevin and David had wrestled Harley Race for the title so many times, I booked Kerry Von Erich vs. Ric Flair in a cage match for the NWA title on Christmas night 1982. A couple of weeks before the match, I set up an angle on TV with Michael Hayes and Ric Flair to show there was no love lost between them. Then, I had a contest in which the fans voted Michael Hayes to be the special troubleshooting referee, and Terry Gordy as the keeper of the cage door. Finally, to really lull the fans into a false sense of security, I booked a six-man tag team match for the undercard in which Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and David Von Erich would team up against Iron Mike Sharp, Ben Sharp, and Tom Steele. I very carefully set it up so that there was no possible way that Rick was walking out of the cage with the belt that night, and completely stacked the odds in Kerry's favor. I built the match up so well that we brought in an astounding $102,000 that night, and it was all because the fans really thought they were going to see the world title change hands. They had no idea what we had in store for them. During the match, referee Michael Hayes turned on Kerry Von Erich, keeper of the door Terry Gordy slammed the cage door on Kerry's head, and Ric Flair covered Kerry for the pin. And fortunately, or unfortunately, we laid it out so perfectly that we nearly had a full-scale right on our hands. Even though I knew that when Terry slammed the door on Kerry's head it would be money in the bank, this got over beyond my wildest imagination. I'm very proud of that particular angle, and it makes me very happy to know that people still talk about it to this day. The legend of that night just spread like wildfire, and the following few weeks we did unbelievable business. Anywhere we went, business was gigantic. At that point, I was on a roll. The buildings were full, novelties were selling, and the concessions were packed. You would think Fritz would be thrilled, and happy to compensate me for a job well done, but he had forgotten who brought him to the dance. In mid-January 1983, I got my checks for the Christmas show. I always got a payoff for booking, a payoff for managing, and a bonus based on the house, if it was in order. When Bronco gave me the envelope in my office, his head was down. He couldn't even look at me. When I opened the envelope, I saw that I got my weekly $700 check for being the booker, never having gotten a raise in over 6 years, a $2,100 check for managing and appearing on the show, and a $2,000 bonus based on the house. I couldn't believe it. I booked a card that brought Fritz over 6 figures, and he threw a $2,000 bonus my way. Based on our new deal, I deserved a $3,800 bonus. It might sound greedy on my part to be complaining about this, but keep in mind that if Fritz and I had kept our original deal, he would have owed me $9,000, so believe me, I was making a huge compromise and was still getting gypped. Plus, this was the 4th supercard I booked in 1982, and he underpaid my commission on every one of them. Also, if you recall in the prior chapter, I had just given up making appearances for Georgia Championship Wrestling on my days off, and making an extra $8,000 a month, simply because it upset Fritz. After all of that, what would you have done? Spoken up to your boss about it, or just allowed it to continue? If you think I'm greedy for the way this story transpires, then so be it. I take responsibility for my actions. After I saw my bonus check, my mind was racing, and I was steaming mad. I was so angry I started cursing, and my old and dear friend Danny Pletches came into my office to try and calm me down. It was a good thing he was there, because I wanted to go upstairs and choke Fritz. I made it clear to Danny that it was the bonus I was upset about, and to emphasize my point, I wadded up the check and threw it across the room. Danny, God love him, asked me to overlook it, reasoning, "Kid, why don't you just let it roll off your back? It's still a $2,000 bonus. Danny, I'm not made that way, I said. I can't accept this. At that point, I went upstairs and told Bronco, I want to see Fritz right away. Bronco jumped out of his chair, exclaiming, he's on the phone. I walked right past him and straight into Fritz's office. What do you want? Fritz bellowed. I got you over $100,000. The biggest house in the history of Texas, and you throw $2,000 my way? Oh. So now you want a part of the profits. That's my deal. I get a percentage of whatever we do, and you've never paid me properly on the big shows. I want the commission that we agreed to and that I deserve for the Christmas show. No way, he said. Absolutely not. You know what, Fritz? I've had it with you, and I'm finished as of today. I know you are, he yelled, because I'm firing you. From there, I went down to my office, took the picture of me and Gino Hernandez off my wall, and walked out of the sportatorium. That's how my run as the booker in Texas ended. Bruiser Brody, Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy, and Buddy Roberts all showed up at my house that evening and pledged their allegiance to me. Michael even offered, do you want us to quit in protest? You brought us in here, and we came here to work for you. I was very touched by their loyalty, but told them, please don't do that. I'll never get another booking job in my life if word got out that when I leave I take all my talent with me. Besides, you owe it to yourselves to stay here, because you're all going to make a lot of money. This place is red hot. Later that night, each one of the Von Erich boys called me, telling me how sorry they were. I assured them this does not affect us. This is between me and your father. It has nothing to do with you. That was the truth. It was between me and Fritz, and after butting heads for almost 7 years, it just got to the point where we were tired of dealing with each other. Since 1976, I had been a booker, babysitter, chaperone, manager, wrestler, matchmaker, TV producer, and wet nurse to a motley crew of guys, produced 4 hours of quality programs a week, and oftentimes booked 14 house shows a week, all without a vacation. I had my wars with Paul Bosch, Joe Blanchard, Nick, and Jerry Kozak, and Fritz Von Erich. I had taken all the responsibility for West Texas, which were considerable, and my patience was wearing thin. No matter how much success I had at the box office, it seemed like I wasn't doing enough, and Fritz refused to pay me what I rightfully earned. Everything became a constant struggle. Did I really want to continue the day-to-day grind? Besides, I had been running that company for almost 7 years, and it was obvious I was leaving on a high note and the territory was at its peak. I had set up the Fabulous Freebirds versus the Von Erichs and Bruiser Brody versus Terry Gordy, so Fritz knew he was in an all-say situation, and would have big money coming in no matter who had the book. After I quit, or was fired, depending on who's telling the story, Fritz started calling promoters around the country telling them that I was nothing but an alcoholic and a drug addict. Now if he had said that I smoked marijuana, he would have been telling the truth, but I was never an alcoholic, and I was never a drug addict. Those were out-and-out lies. Plus, they were such stupid lies. I had just spent the last 7 years running his wrestling company. By spreading that lie about me, what was he saying about him and the people he entrusts to run his company? When you hire someone to run your company, the person you choose says a great deal about you. And when you keep them in that position for close to 7 years, that really says a lot about you. Every promoter was well aware that I had built up the Von Erichs, Great Kabuki, Gino Hernandez, Bruiser Brody, and the Fabulous Freebirds during my run, and that I had just instituted world-class championship wrestling and several supercards a year throughout Texas. If I was nothing but an alcoholic and a drug addict, then I would imagine every promoter would have suddenly wanted a drunk and an addict working in it.